In the light breeze that blew along the coast, Thierry Verneuil's mansion stood proudly, like a witness to the privilege and arrogance of its owner. It was not just a house, it was a monument to power and wealth. Extensive landscaped gardens stretched out front, with sculpted fountains and perfectly trimmed trees. Inside, the polished marble of the floors and columns mingled with the gleam of crystal chandeliers, creating a decor that only belonged to the highest ranks of society. Priceless works of art, antique sculptures and period furniture filled every room, testifying to Thierry's lavish life. Thierry Verneuil was not only a rich man, he was respected, admired, and in many circles, a model to follow. He had built his empire from nothing, making his fortune even more enviable and impressive. His chain of luxury boutiques dominated the market, with international elite clients who had absolute respect for him. His rare cars, some of which were customized to his personal taste, symbolized his success and status. But behind these outward signs of grandeur hid a man consumed by deeply rooted prejudices, beliefs he had inherited from his aristocratic background. Thierry, although moving in modern and cosmopolitan circles, carried a mental burden of discrimination that people like him, members of the old elite, considered as an immutable truth. Thierry was convinced that his world was made up of a rigid hierarchy, a pyramid where people like him, white, rich and established, were at the top, while others, especially black people, were relegated to the bottom. It was a deeply divided worldview, where race determined one's place in society. And this thinking devalued everything that did not fit into its narrow and preconceived framework. This is how one day, in this world that Thierry thought he mastered so well, Aisha entered his life. Aisha was a young black woman, bright and full of life, from a working-class neighborhood where dreams were often crushed by the harsh realities of life. But within her shone a rare intelligence, a natural beauty and a grace that did not go unnoticed. Despite her modest origins, Aisha possessed a dignity that contrasted with the poverty that surrounded her. Her family had always dreamed of a better life, and she was determined to make it happen, even if it meant starting with a job serving those who had everything. When Thierry hired her as a servant, he first saw her as a simple employee, an interchangeable part in the vast mechanism of his mansion. She was there to clean, cook, take care of household chores, and should not exceed the invisible limits of this role. But over time, Aisha distinguished herself by her competence and seriousness, and soon she became one of Thierry's closest assistants, a silent member of his world, observing behind the scenes of social life and business. Thierry, although often indifferent to his employees, ends up developing a form of attraction for Aisha, a complex mixture of desire and denial. He looked at her from afar, with an eye that was both condescending and fascinated. Her delicate features, her proud posture, and her calm in the face of the authority he exercised over her disturbed him. He found her beautiful, but he couldn't help but relegate her to her place, to that of the black employee who didn't deserve to share his world. It was one evening, when the summer heat had set in and the sea murmured in the background, that Thierry found himself with Aisha, in a situation he had not anticipated. What had started as a simple attention from him, a brief conversation between them, quickly turned into a moment of temptation.
Without thinking, in the shadow of a nascent desire, Thierry succumbed.
He seduced her. What followed was a spiral of shame and confusion. Thierry, while being a man of power, was also fragile in his convictions. The idea that he had acted on impulse with a woman he considered an employee, an inferior, deeply disturbed him. He didn't tell anyone, but in his mind he tried to minimize the incident. Until Aisha discovered that she was pregnant. The shock was not only that of the situation but also of the fact that such a thing could happen in Sun World. Aisha, the black woman, had trapped him in a situation he considered undignified. The reality of the accident and the unexpected pregnancy upset Thierry. What frightened him most of all was not so much the pregnancy itself, but the shame he felt at the possible public disapproval. A black woman pregnant with him, in his mansion? This simply could not be accepted. This pregnancy risked tarnishing the image he had carefully constructed. He began to think of solutions to erase this error. Logically, he knew that Aisha had to be removed from his life, but what he had not anticipated was the brutality of his decision. With shocking coldness, Thierry chose to dismiss her unceremoniously. She was kicked out of the mansion, thrown out with an already round belly, an uncertain future ahead of her. Her dream of getting out became a brutal nightmare. He had no hesitation. In his eyes, she had become an embarrassment, a dishonor that he could not tolerate. The first years after her expulsion were a brutal shock for Aisha. She found herself alone, with a round belly and an uncertain future. Thierry, in his arrogance and denial, thought that his rejection of Aisha would break her will, that his forced departure from his mansion would erase all hope of a future for her. But what he didn't know was the inner strength she possessed. It was not a simple question of survival for Aisha. It was a question of dignity. Of the dignity of a mother ready to sacrifice everything for her child, and of the dignity of a woman who refused to let herself be reduced to the image that people wanted to impose on her. Aisha lived in a small, modest apartment, a cramped and sometimes unsanitary place, but it was her home, and it was there that she nourished her dreams. Every day, she tried to wake up with the hope of building something bigger, more just. Mokken, his son, was growing up quickly, with a bright smile and a lively mind. Aisha told him every evening the stories of strong women, leaders, warriors, teaching him that his skin color would never be an obstacle to his success. Men of power try to make us believe that we are weak, but true strength lies in resisting their gaze, she told him. This message would mark his entire education. The first jobs were hard. Aisha took on small tasks. Housekeeper, seamstress, waitress. Nothing was too small or too thankless. She woke up early, worked late into the night, saving every penny to allow Mokken to attend the best schools. But more than anything, Aisha knew that the key to her rise lay in her talents, in what she carried within herself, a potential that the world had ignored. From a young age, she had developed an innate taste for fashion, couture, and aesthetics. This had always been her dream, but the reality of her social condition, her family responsibilities, and the hostile environment in which she had grown up had made her forget this desire. However, the idea that she could give birth to a fashion brand, a house that would belong to her, became an obsession. She began sewing in the evenings after work, teaching herself the basics of design and sewing. Little by little, she improved, her creations becoming more and more refined. One day, she dared to take the plunge and created her first collection, modest but full of promise. His friends and neighbors, initially skeptical, were the first to encourage him. They saw in her not only raw talent, but also rare determination. Little by little, Aisha managed to make a name for herself in the world of fashion, a fashion which, unlike that of the big houses, was accessible, inclusive, and respectful of diversity. Its niche, affordable luxury, quality fashion at prices that did not condemn women to a life of incessant effort. His pieces quickly became prized, not only for their beauty, but also for their message of rebellion against the norms imposed by an elitist society. The mark of Aisha, Aisha Diop Couture, developed, slowly but surely. She succeeded in convincing local investors and making a name for herself among emerging creators. His collections were distinguished by vibrant colors, exotic fabrics, and meticulous attention to detail. She refused to imitate white beauty standards, challenging dominant fashion ideals. In each piece, there was a message, that of inclusiveness, of equality, of reaffirming the cultural roots of Black women and their power. Each garment told a story. The story of resilience, of rediscovered dignity, of emancipation. Success came gradually, but inevitably. Women, black or white, felt powerful when they wore his creations. They were proud, they felt visible, they felt beautiful, and most of all, they felt respected. And Aisha had become much more than a creator. She had become a symbol of what resilience and ambition could achieve. His company became a pillar of contemporary fashion, an example of success against all expectations. Mokken, his son, grew up in this atmosphere of ambition and resistance. He was her main support and the driving force behind her work. Every evening she spoke to him about her dreams, about her legacy, about what she had accomplished, not only for herself but for both of them. Mokken, brilliant and disciplined, threw himself into studying finance and strategy to strengthen the family empire he intended to one day lead. Aisha was not only a mother, she was a mentor, a constant source of inspiration. She taught him to see beyond appearances, to never let himself be defined by what others expected of him. The years passed, and Aisha's house became a national success. She diversified into developing her own makeup line, then opening several stores across the country. She also devoted part of her fortune to her Mochen Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to promoting the education of children from disadvantaged neighborhoods, providing them with scholarships, apprenticeship programs, and resources so that they too can dream of a better life. It was then that destiny caught up with her in an unexpected form. Thierry Vernuil, the man who had once rejected her, found himself facing the reality of his own failures. He had continued his career with an impeccable facade, but the cracks began to show. His empire, founded on a superficial image and a lack of real ethics, began to weaken. Journalists became increasingly critical of him, and scandals broke out around his business practices and questionable relationships. He was seen less as a pillar of society and more as an example of the disconnected and corrupt elite. But it is when the article on Aisha Diop appeared in a major newspaper, which Thierry felt the greatest thrill of his life. The title, in imposing letters, announced the news. Fashion designer Aisha Diop inaugurates a luxury boutique in the city's chic district. Below, a subtitle mentioned its foundation, the Mochen Foundation, and its commitment to the education of disadvantaged children. Thierry, upon seeing Aisha's name, could only freeze, a feeling of frozen panic seizing him. He then understood that she had become much more than just a creator. She was a figure of power. An icon. She had transcended everything he had tried to impose on her, and her success was far greater than anything he had ever hoped to accomplish. Aisha was no longer an employee, a servant, or even a simple woman from her past. She was the person he should have respected and honored from the start. Aisha had never sought revenge on Thierry, even if his departure from her life had left a wound. She had made a clear decision from the start. She would not allow herself to be defined by the betrayal or the stereotypes she faced. She had drawn her strength from the trials, transforming her pain into an engine of personal and professional transformation. Her success was not an act of revenge, but the fruit of an unwavering desire to prove, first to herself, then to the whole world, that she had the right to succeed despite the obstacles imposed by society and by those who had sought to demean her. When she met Thierry during this social event, she felt that the moment had come, not to take revenge, but to close a chapter in her life. She looked into his eyes, and in that precise moment, all the weight of the years she had lived through seemed to blossom in her gaze. Thierry had changed. His features, marked by the years and the pressure of success built on fragile foundations, bore witness to his own inner struggle. He was no longer the self-confident man she had known, the one who had imposed silence on her through his position and his privileges. When he stood up upon seeing her, he tried to play his role as master of ceremonies, the one who, despite everything, remained at the top of his social hierarchy. But Aisha was no longer the same woman. She advanced with calculated slowness, each step resonating as an affirmation of her own evolution. When she came face to face with him, she felt neither resentment nor anger, but an implacable calm. She looked at him with a depth that he himself did not understand, a look that transcended everything he could have imagined of her. "Thierry," she said with a voice that did not tremble, but which carried all the force of experience, "you threw me out of your life because I was black, but you forgot that the color of my skin was never a brake on my ambition. You rejected me as a stranger, but it was not me who lost. It was you."
His words hit Thierry like a bolt from the blue.
He opened his mouth to respond, but he didn't have time to say a single word. Aisha continued, her gaze remaining fixed on him, unwavering. "I seek neither your pity nor your forgiveness.
I do not need you.
But I am happy to see you there, in this light, because that is exactly where you deserve to be." These last words were spoken with such clarity, such assurance, that everyone around seemed hanging on his lips. Aisha did not need to do more, she had said the essentials. She was at the top, not in the heights of luxury and power, but in the silent victory she had over Thierry, that of her rediscovered dignity and her success which, despite everything, eluded her. She turned on her heel without looking back, leaving behind Thierry paralyzed by stupor and shame. He stood there, his eyes fixed on the image of the woman he had once rejected, but who had now taken up a place much greater than the one he had imagined. She didn't need him or his approval. She had transcended her past, built her future, and left behind the man who believed he could break her. In the days that followed, Thierry found himself alone with his thoughts. The meeting with Aisha had provoked an inner whirlwind in him, a questioning that he had never anticipated. He locked himself in his office, trying to analyze every word she had said. He tried to rationalize the situation, to find excuses, but the more he thought about it, the more he felt the magnitude of his mistake. He had let himself be blinded by his privileges, by his own ego, and he had believed that the crushing of Aisha was a victory. However, he realized, too late, that he had only added chains to his own freedom. Aisha, for her part, continued on her way. She was no longer simply a fashion entrepreneur, she had become an icon, a source of inspiration for those who fought against injustice, against stereotypes, against oppression. She had learned to rebuild herself after each failure, to raise her son Mochen with the principles of dignity and resilience, instilling in him the values of inclusiveness and ambition that she herself held. She was no longer defined by circumstances, but by her own will. Thierry, for his part, found himself looking at this woman, this model of success, from the outside. He had nothing to offer her, nothing to prove to her. The distance between them, which had continued to widen since he had rejected her, was now insurmountable. Aisha's true victory, Thierry finally understood, lay not only in her success, but in her ability to rise after humiliation, to build herself apart from the validation of others, and to establish herself as a force in her own right in a world that had long ignored her. That was his true power. And Thierry just had to admit it. Aisha had not only won, but she had done it with a grace he could never hope to match.